Today we're going to take a look at 15 more procedural textures that I created through experimentation. My hope is that you see these textures and you learn a little bit more about how these interact with each other, or you just use these in your own more complex procedural textures or patterns that you create. So let's take a look at how I made these. To set up our scene for the textures, let's get rid of that cube and bring in a plane. I'm going to change the whole middle screen to my shader editor and hit N to get rid of this shelf on the right here. Then change that top right to my 3D viewport. I'm scrolling a little bit here and scroll across the top, and I can click off these overlays. Just make this easier to see. And I'm going to hold down Z and move my mouse up, and we'll be in rendered mode. Then I'm going to come over here and let's select that material that was on our cube and just put it on our plane. I'm going to get rid of this principled BSDF. This is texture 1. To get started, let's bring in a Voronoi node and just place it here. I'm going to hit Control Shift left click to get that viewer going. And let's change this to F2 Manhattan, just like that. And we'll leave everything else as is. And just make sure that Voronoi is highlighted and hit Control T. That brings up the texture coordinate and mapping node. And I'll just move those over. Just make sure this is coming out of object. I'll move this mapping node down a little bit. Then I'm going to duplicate this Voronoi and place it right here and just make sure distance is running into vector. And I'm going to duplicate it one more time and just put it down here. Make sure vector is running in there. And we're actually going to mix these together, and we're going to change this type to subtract, which is just down here. This top Voronoi is going to be F2 Minkowski, and I'm going to change the scale to 0.5, the exponent to 0.5, or I guess I'll just leave it at 0.5, and then the randomness to 0. And then down here we're going to change this to distance to edge, and I'm just going to change the scale to 1 and the randomness to 0. Next step is we're going to bring in a gradient and just place it right here. Let's run object into that vector and just take a look at what's going on. We're going to change this to spherical, and so we've got our spherical gradient there, but then we're going to change something here with some vector math, and this is just a math node that applies to all three variables, so x, y, and z. And I'm going to just change this from add to scale, which is kind of like a multiply function that just applies the multiply to each variable the same. So 1 times x, 1 times y, 1 times z. I'm going to duplicate this scale and place it here, and I'm going to change this to fraction. And what that allows us to do is have basically 4 different sections. If this was generated, it would just be one section, but because it's object, the origin point's in the middle, so we got 4 different sections there. I'm going to duplicate this one more time and just change this to add, and we're going to have to play around with the x and the y, which is the top two. And I think if we just move it back to negative 0.5, that gives us 4 equal gradients, just with origins in each of these 4 squares here. I'm going to bring in a color ramp and just place it right here. And we're going to bring the black up to 0.4, and the white is going to come down to 0.65. Just like that. And then let's bring in a math node here. Just place it right here. Change this to multiply. And we're going to change this value in here to 6.2. And then plug this multiply output into the scale on that first Voronoi we made. Let's see what's happening here. Just going to view that. We can pretty much see our end texture there. We just need to add 2 mix RGBs here. And I'll just place them after this Voronoi. And we're going to change the first one to color burn and change color 2 on that to black. And this is going to be color dodge. We're going to change color 2 on that one to white. Let's change this factor on the color burn to 0.9, and then we'll drag this one across to 1. And there we go. That's texture number 1 right there. I found you could get some pretty interesting results with this color ramp just by moving this around. You can adjust how far those textures go, and if we flip these around, we get some pretty cool stuff here as well. Stuff that would be interesting to play around with, just see what different things we can get. I'm just going to go back for a second, and I just want to demonstrate this scale vector here. So if you move this up, you can see that those circles decrease and increase in size, but the pattern behind just stays the same. So because this vector math is only connected to this top section, it's just controlling that. But if I was to connect it down here as well, for instance, and then adjust this, we can see that everything moves in sync. Up next, we're going to take a look at texture 2. First up, let's bring in a Voronoi here and just place it here. Control Shift left click to bring out that preview. and I'm going to go ahead and set this to smooth F1 Minkowski. Then I'm going to change the exponent to, actually no, sorry, I'm going to change the randomness to 0, and everything else I'll just leave the same. And while I'm clicking on this Voronoi, hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate and mapping node, and make sure this is coming out of object. Then I'm going to go ahead and move these over a little bit and move this mapping node down. Let's go ahead and bring in a gradient, place it here, run object into that vector, and change this to spherical. And let's see what we've got so far. Yeah, it's just a circle there. So then what we can do is bring in a color ramp and just place it after this gradient. And I'm not going to change anything on that, but I am going to do that same vector math I did in the first one, which is just affecting all 3 variables there. So I'm going to change this first one to scale, duplicate that, change this one to fraction, then duplicate that and change this one to add, and change both of these values to -0.5. Then I'm going to bring in a math node and place it right here, change this to multiply, and change the value to 9.7. Then this value output here, I'm going to plug this into the scale on that Voronoi. We can kind of see our texture taking shape there, and I'm going to bring in 2 mix RGBs and just place them right here. Change this first one to color burn. We're going to change color 2 on that one to black. And then the second one is going to be color dodge. We're going to change color 2 on that one to white. This factor we're going to leave as is, and this one we're going to drag across. And I don't think this looks quite right. I think instead of spherical, this should be actually quadratic sphere. And yeah, that's looking way better. This is texture 2. So there's a bunch of stuff you could do while playing around with this one. You could change the type of Voronoi, for instance. Let's turn this down. So, you know, it looks pretty interesting with distance to edge there. We can also come over here to the multiply node and make this more or less complex, which is kind of cool. We could come over here to the color ramp and adjust this, and we can kind of see how those gradients are being affected a bit more now. You know, this scale effect here is just way more noticeable when we adjust that color ramp. We could also rotate the whole thing, but this doesn't affect, you know, every texture. It just affects half of the textures basically, so we get this really cool effect. This is the next one we're going to make, texture 3. Let's bring in a Voronoi, and let's place it here. And this is going to be F2 Minkowski. Let's get the Control Shift left click preview going here, and I'm going to adjust this, just change the exponent to 1.2 and the randomness to 0, just like that. And while this Voronoi is highlighted, I'm going to hit Control T and bring up the texture coordinate mapping node and plug those in. Make sure it's coming out of object, and move this mapping node down a little bit here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a gradient and place it here, run object into that guy. Let's see what's going on. We'll change this to spherical. Then we're going to add some vector nodes, or vector math, pardon me here. This one here we'll place there, and we'll change this to scale and just leave it at 1. Duplicate that and place it afterwards and change this to fraction, and then duplicate this one more time and change this to add. Then we have to adjust these to -0.5 to get those gradients in the middle of those 4 squares. So then what we'll do is we'll bring in a color ramp, just place it here, and then I'm going to bring the black up to 0.15, and I'll just leave the white at 1. Then I'm going to bring in a math node and just place that right here, and just change this to multiply, and then change this value to 5.5, just like that. Then we'll plug this into the scale of this Voronoi here, and let's add 2 mix RGBs on here, just one there and one here. And we'll change this to color burn, change color 2 on that guy to black, and the second one is going to be color dodge, and change color 2 on that one to white. Then this factor on the color burn is going to be 0.7, and then this color dodge factor is going to be 1. So it's pretty much done. The only thing I did after this is I was like, hey, I wonder what happens if I put a gradient texture here, and then I changed this to quadratic sphere. And there we go. We've got texture number 3. This one's a lot of fun to play around with. First of all, maybe we just change this to radial. Then why don't we bump this up to like 4? You know, that looks like a pretty cool texture on the top right there. Maybe we could move these around here a little bit and just change. That actually looks like a really interesting transition. I don't know, with some motion graphics, it'd be kind of interesting to incorporate into something. We could adjust this stuff here too, get some cool stuff when we adjust the color ramp pretty much every time. So I always try and play around with that guy. Then what if we came over here to the Z rotation and started rotating this? That looks pretty cool too. Very interesting. This is the next texture we're going to take a look at, texture 4. And texture 4 has some interesting symmetry going on along the horizontal axis. To start off, I'm going to bring in a noise texture this time and just hit Control T and Control Shift left click on that to get the preview. I'm going to plug this from object going into the mapping node there, and let's move these guys over a little bit. I'm going to bring in a Voronoi node, just place it here, and make sure distance is going into vector on that noise there. Then I'm going to change this top one to Manhattan and then change the randomness to 0. I'm going to duplicate this Voronoi with Control Shift D, which just keeps it attached to this mapping node, which is kind of helpful. And then I'm going to change, actually nothing on this one here, but I am going to mix these two together, just like this. So we got this mix. Let's open this up here, and let's just change this to subtract and to 1. So we can see in the top right here, we're not getting much for our preview. I think that's because these scales are set the same. So if I change these around, then we start getting something happening there. You know, it's pretty fun to play around with. But what I'm going to actually do is, let's just make a mark there, because I'm going to bring in a gradient texture and just place it right here. Then let's change this from linear to radial. And we get this pattern up here happening. Then you can kind of tune this here to something that looks pretty good. And I found that 10 looked pretty good. And then I'm going to come down here and change this one to 8, just like that. Let's come over here and bring in a separate XYZ node and just place it right here. Run object into vector there. Then I'm going to bring in 2 gradient textures. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and plug that into X and Y and change this to spherical. Change this one to spherical as well. Then I'm going to add these together with a math node. So just run these both from color, I think is going to work better. Yeah, we get this interesting texture that shows up here. Yeah, I'm not sure why it happens, but I was just playing around with it, and it looked kind of interesting, so I was like, I'll use that in something. So I'm going to bring in a color ramp, place it right there. Then I'm going to bring in another math node, place it right here, and just change this to multiply. Then let's go ahead and change this to 5.7 right here. And we're going to plug this into the scale on that first noise texture that we made, just like right here. And there we go. That's pretty much our texture. We're going to bring in 2 mix RGBs, place them right here. Change this first one to color burn, change that color to black, and then change the second one to color dodge. We're going to change this color to white. Let's go ahead and drag this factor right here to 0.48, and then change this one to 1. There's one more thing I forgot to do, and that's just to adjust this distortion on this noise texture at the beginning. We're going to change that to 1. And there we go. That is texture number 4. This is the next one we're going to take a look at. This is texture 5. This one is actually going to start out with a noise texture as well. Going to Control Shift left click, get that preview going, and hit Control T. Make sure this is coming out of object. Let me move these over a little bit. I'm going to bring in a Voronoi, place it here, and make sure distance is going into the vector. Then while this is highlighted, hit Control Shift D, and that just duplicates it with that noodle attached. Let's mix these two together, and I'm going to change this mix type to subtract, and change this to 1. Oops, the factor to 1, just like that. And because these are both the same, it just gives me a black image, so I need to change that. Let's go ahead and just view this guy here. But basically, one of these, has to be different. So I'm going to start by changing this top one to Smooth F1 and to Chebyshev. And then I'm going to change the scale to 10 and the randomness to 0. This bottom one is going to be Smooth F1 Chebyshev as well. And this scale is going to be 18.6, and the randomness is going to be 0 as well. I'm going to move these over a little bit and just make this little separation here, and that's holding down Shift and dragging right click through a noodle chain like that. It just makes a node point there. I'm going to bring in a gradient texture, place it here, and we're going to change this to radial. So this is kind of similar to the last one, and we're going to actually do something similar here as well, where we add in a separate XYZ, make sure object is running into that vector there. We're going to bring in a gradient texture and change this to spherical. We're going to duplicate this guy and just plug X and Y into those two, and then we're going to bring in a math node here and just add these together, just the colors there. Let's view what's going on there. It's got this interesting shape up there with the two spherical nodes added together. Then we're going to bring in a color ramp, place it here, then bring in a math node, place it here, and then change this to multiply, change this to 13.9. Then we're going to plug this into the scale on that initial noise texture. See what's happening there. It's kind of similar to the last one. Then I'm going to bring in two mix RGBs, place them here. Change this first one to color burn, change this factor to 0.43, and then change this color 2 to black. Change this one to color dodge, change this to 1, and then change color 2 on here to white. So what we're going to do a little bit differently here is change this color ramp around so that these are reversed, like this here. So we can kind of see these interesting images come into shape here. This white, what we're going to do is we're going to set this at 0.36, just like that. Then this black, we're going to set this at 1, just like that. And the last thing we're going to do is come over to this first noise texture, just change this distortion to 1. And there we go. That's texture number 5. I thought it was pretty interesting to play around with this color ramp here. If you drag the black down, you can kind of see those, some of the spikes disappearing there. And if you drag the white up, it kind of slowly starts to outline this diamond shape in the middle there. You can change a lot of stuff. I like, as always, these Z rotations, usually pretty cool. And, I think that one looks pretty interesting too. So, play around with these settings, see what you can do. The next one we're going to take a look at is texture 6. Let's start out with a Voronoi texture. Just bring that in, place it here. Let's change this to F2 and Manhattan, just like that. And we'll set the randomness to 0.25. Click on this Voronoi and hit Control T and make sure object is plugged into vector. And let's go ahead and hit Control Shift left click on that Voronoi, get the preview going. Let's go ahead and move this stuff over a little bit. And we're just going to place another Voronoi right here. Make sure distance is plugged into vector. We're going to change this to distance to edge. Then we're going to set the scale to 1 and the randomness to 0. Then let's come over here and let's add in a gradient texture and plug object into that vector there. Let's change this to spherical and let's see what that's doing. It's just giving us a circle. We're going to add some vector math on here. So go ahead and select that, and let's just change this to scale and change this to 2. Duplicate this, put it here, and then change this to fraction. Then duplicate it one more time and change this to add. And this is going to center those gradients if we set it to negative 0.5, just like that. Let's go ahead and add a color ramp in here. We're going to bring the black up to 0.4. And bring the bring the white down to 0.7, just like that. Let's add a math node in here. Just place it right after the color ramp and change this to multiply. Then change that value to 5.6. Then we're going to plug this into the scale on that first Voronoi we created and just view that one. And let's add 2 mix RGBs here, one after the other. Change this first one to color burn and color 2 on that to black. Second one's going to be color dodge, and color 2 is going to be white on that one. This first factor we're going to set at 0.9, and then we're going to drag this across to the right there. Actually 0.99, just like that. And that drags across to the right there. And then the last thing we want to do is just rotate this Z on the mapping node to 20 degrees. And there we go. We've got texture number 6. This is the next texture we're going to do, texture number 7. Let's bring in a Voronoi texture and put that there. Control Shift left click to get the preview going. Let's change it to F2 and Minkowski. I'm going to go ahead and set the exponent at 0.7 and the randomness is going to be set at 0. While this is highlighting, hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate mapping node and plug object into vector there. And then move the mapping down here. Let me move this over a little bit. We're going to bring in a gradient. Just put it here and change it to that to quadratic sphere and plug this into vector. And let's see what's going on there. It's just a circle. And let's bring in a color ramp and a math node. Put that here. And I'm going to change this to multiply. Change this value to 9.7. I'm going to bring in some vector math. Just put it, oops, not vector, curves, vector math there. Put it right here and change this to scale. And we'll just leave that at 1. Duplicate it, change this to fraction. Duplicate it again, change this to add, and change the top two values to negative 0.5. And that just centers all those gradients in our 4 squares that we created there. Then we're going to plug this multiply output into the scale of this Voronoi, and let's see what's going on there. It's basically our texture, but we're going to add 2 mix RGBs here just to finish it off. Put those like that. Change this first one to color burn and change color 2 on that one to black. The second one's going to be color dodge and change the color 2 on that one to white. Then the factor on the color burn is going to be set at 0.9, and the factor on the color dodge is going to be dragged across to 1 there. The last thing we need to do is just come over to this mapping node and set this X scale value to 0.2. And there we go. That is texture 7. This is the next one we're going to do, which is texture 8. Kind of liked how this one had, it looked like it kind of bulged out of the page at you with this 3D pattern. Let's start off with a Voronoi texture. Just put it in here. Control Shift left click to get that preview going. We're going to change this to smooth F1 and Minkowski, just like that. I'm going to change this randomness to 0, leave everything else as is, and hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate mapping node, and make sure object is plugged into the mapping there. Move these over a bit here. Let's add in a gradient texture. I'm going to change this to spherical, plug object into that vector, and let's see what's going on there. We can bring in a color ramp, put it here, and I'm going to bring the black to 0.1, and the white is going to come down a little bit. It's going to come down to 0.75, just like that. I'm going to bring in a math node, put it here, and let's change this to multiply, change this number to 9.7, just like that. And let's plug this into the scale on the Voronoi. We can just kind of view what's going on there. So then I'm going to bring in some vector math nodes, not vector curves, vector math there, and change this to scale. We'll leave it at 1. I'm going to duplicate that and change the second one to fraction. I'm going to duplicate that again and change this one to add. And this is going to allow us to center those by changing the 2 top values to negative 0.5. I'm going to duplicate this gradient texture and just put this right before that first scale there and leave it at spherical. Let's come over here to the end and just put 2 mix RGBs after that first Voronoi texture we set up. This first one is going to be set to color burn, and color 2 is going to be set to black. The second one is going to be color dodge, and color 2 on that one is going to be set to white. And the factor on the color burn we'll set to 0.85, and on the color dodge we'll just drag it across to 1. Then I'm going to come over here to the mapping node and change the Z rotation to 45 degrees, just like that. And there we go. This is texture number 8. Next we're going to check out texture number 9. Let's bring in a noise texture, put it here, and I'm just going to change the distortion to 1. Let's Control Shift left click and get that preview going, and hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate and mapping node, and just make sure object is plugged into the mapping node there. Let's go ahead and bring in a separate XYZ node, put it here, run object into that guy as well. I'm going to bring in a gradient texture and change this to spherical and just plug X into there, and duplicate this guy and plug Y into the second one. We're going to bring in a math node and just add those both together, just the colors. Let's see what's going on there. It creates this interesting shape. Let's add in a color ramp right after that add, and just duplicate this add here and change this to multiply. I'm going to move this noise over a little bit and run the multiply output into the scale. Let's see what's going on there. It's not really much yet. I'm going to actually add in a Voronoi texture right in front of that noise texture. Just make sure distance is going into vector there. We're going to change these settings to F1 Manhattan, just like that. The scale is going to be 8, and the randomness is going to be set to 0, just like that. You can see there's kind of a very faint texture forming there. I'm going to add in a gradient texture right here and just change this to radial. just like that. And now what we're going to do is add in 2 mix RGBs at the end here. Change this one to color burn. Change color 2 on that guy to black. The second one is going to be color dodge, and color 2 on that one is going to be white. Then the factor on the color burn, let's change that to 0.48, and the factor on the color dodge is going to be 1. And come over here to this multiply node and change this value to 1.5. And there we go, we got texture number 9. This is the next texture we're going to do, texture number 10. Let's start off with a noise texture and just Control Shift left click and get that preview going. I'm going to change the distortion to 1. Hit Control T, bring up a texture coordinate and mapping node, make sure object is plugged into the mapping node. I'm just going to move these guys over. I'm going to bring in a Voronoi and just place it right here after the mapping node. Make sure distance is going into the vector there. We're going to change this type to smooth F1 Chebyshev. Just like that. Then we'll change the scale to 8. We'll leave the smoothness as is, and we'll change the randomness to 0. I'm going to add in a gradient right before that one. Just place it here. We're going to change this to radial, just like that. Then I'm going to come over here and add a separate XYZ node in here. Plug object into that vector. Then we're going to bring in a gradient and change this to spherical. Plug X into that one, duplicate it, plug Y into the bottom one. We're going to make a math node here, add these 2 gradients together. We'll take a look at what that's doing here, just kind of creating this interesting pattern. I'm going to bring in a color ramp, put it here, and the white is actually going to come down to 0.49, and we'll bring the black up above the white at 0.85. Bring in another math node, just duplicate this add and change this one to multiply. I'm going to change this value to 9.7. Then we're going to plug this value here into the scale on that first noise we created. Let's take a look. It's basically our texture there. We're just going to add in these 2 mix RGBs and change the first one to color burn. Change color 2 on that one to black. And the second one's going to be color dodge. Color 2 on that one's going to be white. And then we're going to change the factor on the color burn to 0.43, and the factor on the color dodge is going to be dragged across to 1. And there we go. This is texture number 10. This is the next one here, texture 11. And I really liked how it almost had a 3D effect. It kind of looked like an egg in the way that these lines kind of continued across these gaps as well. That's why I chose this one. Let's start off with a Voronoi. Put it here. Let's get the preview going with Control Shift left click there. We're going to change this to F1 Manhattan, and we'll change this randomness to 0.8. I'm going to hit Control T and bring up the texture coordinate and mapping node and plug object into that mapping node there. I'm going to duplicate this Voronoi, put it here, and make sure distance is running into that vector there. We're going to change this to F1 Minkowski. And then I'm going to hit Control Shift D. That duplicates it while it's still connected. We're going to mix these 2 together. Change this to subtract, and change this factor to 1. This bottom Voronoi, I'm going to change this to F2 Euclidean. And this scale is going to be 5, and the randomness is going to be 0. No, sorry, the random or scale is going to be 1.5, just like that. And then this top one, the Minkowski, let's set this scale here at 0.7, and the randomness is going to be 0, just like that. Let's come over here and set up a separate XYZ node. Put that up here and run object into this guy. I'm going to bring in a math node. Put it here, change this to power, and change the exponent to 2. Plug the X into that base and duplicate it and plug Y into this base down here. Just going to move these over a little bit, duplicate that math node and change this to add. We're going to add these 2 together. And also, let's view this. I'm going to also put this add node here, change it to multiply, and change this to 0.7. So it just gets a little taller there. That's kind of how we got that egg shape. I'm going to bring in a color ramp. Just put it right afterwards. I'm going to change that black value to 0.25, and this white value is actually going to be just below it at 0.22. I'm going to bring in another math node. This multiply actually can just be duplicated and put here. I'm going to change this value to 3. I'm going to run this into the scale of that first Voronoi we set up, and let's see what's going on there. It's basically our texture. I'm just going to bring in 2 mix RGBs and just put them here. This first one is going to be color burn, and color 2 is going to be black. Second one is going to be color dodge, and the color is going to be white on that one. The factor of this first one is going to be 0.77, and then the factor of the second one, we just drag across to 1. And there we go. This is texture number 11. This is the next one we're going to take a look at, texture 12. For this one, I'm going to bring in a Voronoi texture. Let's put that here. Control Shift left click to bring up the preview there. Let's just change this to F2, and we'll change the randomness to 0.5, just like that. Hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate mapping node. Make sure this is coming out of object there. We're going to bring in another Voronoi and put that right here. Make sure distance is going into vector there. We're going to duplicate this with Control Shift D, which keeps it attached to this mapping node. We'll just mix these two together. We're going to change this to subtract, and we're going to change this value. Actually, we're going to leave it at 0.5, just like that. This top Voronoi is going to be F2 Minkowski. We'll change the scale to 0.4, leave the exponent at 0.5, and change the randomness to 0. This bottom one is also going to be F2 Minkowski, and let's set that up. But the scale is going to be 2.5, and the randomness, again, is just going to be 0 there. You can see an interesting pattern taking shape there, and we're going to add in a separate XYZ and just make a little mask for it. Plug object into this guy here, and we're going to bring in a math node and change this to power. Change the exponent to 2 and just plug X into that guy and duplicate it and plug Y into the bottom one. Let's duplicate that one and change it to add. We're just going to add these together, and let's take a look at what's going on. We've just got our circle there. Let's go ahead and duplicate this power node up here and change it to multiply and change this value to 1.3, just like that. And actually this bottom exponent as well, let's change this to 4 so we get a bit of a longer shape there. Then we're going to bring in a color ramp and put it right after this add here. We're going to change the black value to 0.58, and the white value is going to come below it at 0.2. Let's go ahead and duplicate this math node back here, this multiply, and just put it after the color ramp. And I'm going to change this value to 1.8. Then we're going to plug this output right here into the scale of that first Voronoi we set up, and let's take a look at what's going on there. I'm going to bring in two mix RGBs, just put them right after each other. Change this first one to color burn, and change the color to black on that one. And the second one is going to be color dodge. Color 2 is going to be white on this one. The factor of that first one we're going to set to 0.68, and the factor of the second one we'll drag across to 1. And there we go. This is texture 12. This is the next one we're going to do, texture 13. Let's start off with a noise texture here. Let's hit Control Shift left click and bring out that view there. Hit Control T on this guy and move this over and make sure object is plugged into vector there. Let's bring in a Voronoi, put it right here, and make sure distance is plugged into vector. I'm going to change the settings on, first of all, actually the noise is fine, but let's change the Voronoi to distance to edge, and the randomness is going to be 0.7, just like that. Then we're going to go ahead and bring in a gradient, just put it right before that Voronoi. We'll change this to radial. Let's try creating these mix RGBs a little earlier this time. That way we can kind of see what's going on a bit better. This first one's going to be color burn, and the second one is going to be color dodge, just like that. Color 2 on the color burn is going to be black. Color 2 on the color dodge is going to be white. Then the factor on this guy is going to be 0.42, and the factor on this guy is just going to be 1, just like that. Let's come over here and set up a separate XYZ node. Place it here, run object into that guy. Then we're going to create a few math nodes. Put one right here and run X into this guy. Let's duplicate that and run Y into the bottom one. Let's duplicate that one more time and just add these two together. Let's see what's going on. We're going to change this top one to absolute, and this bottom one is going to be power, and then the exponent on that one is going to be 2. Let's add in a color ramp afterwards and just put it right here. I'm going to set the black value to 0.45, and we'll just leave the white at 1. I'm going to duplicate this math one more time and just change this to multiply, and then this value is going to be 13.8. Let's plug this into the noise there and into the scale, and let's view this color dodge here. Then to make this texture look exactly like the one I had in the picture, we just need to come to this color ramp and change this white value to a value of 0.85, and then come down here to the scale on this Voronoi distance to edge texture and change the scale to 5.89, just like that. And this is texture 13. This is the texture we're going to take a look at next here. Let's start out with a noise texture and just put it here. Control Shift left click to get that preview going. Let's change the distortion to 1. I'm going to hit Control T and make sure object is plugged into that mapping node. Let's just move these over a little bit here. We're going to bring in a Voronoi and put it right here. Change this to Manhattan and make sure distance is plugged into the vector there. I'm going to change this to 8 for the scale and 0 for the randomness, and then bring in a gradient and put it right before that Voronoi. Change this to radial. Come over here and bring in a separate XYZ node. Place it right here, run object into that vector. We're going to bring in some math nodes. I'm going to put this one here and change this to absolute. Then duplicate it and change this one to power. Change that exponent to 2. X is going to go into that top one and Y is going to go into that bottom one. And we're going to change this to, or we're going to duplicate that one and change it to add. And just add these together. Let's see what's going on there. We're going to bring in a color ramp and put it right here, and black is going to be at 0.2, whereas we're going to leave white at 1. I'm going to bring in another math node, place it here, and change this to multiply. We're going to change this factor, or the value rather, to 2.2. Then we'll run this into the scale on that noise texture. Let's see what's going on there. Then what we're going to do is bring in 2 mix RGBs, place one right here and one right afterwards, and change this to color burn for the first one. Change color 2 on that one to black. And this one, second one's going to be color dodge, and color 2 on that one's going to be white. The factor on the color burn is going to be 0.48, and the factor on the color dodge is going to be 1. And there we go. This is texture 14. The last one we're going to take a look at is this guy here. It's going to be texture 15. Let's start off with a noise texture. Bring that in, and we'll just change the detail to 0.1, and the roughness is going to be at 1, and the distortion is going to be at 1 as well. Let's go ahead and view that, and let's just bring in our mix RGBs right away. Why don't we try it different this time? Set up this first one to be color burn. Color 2 on that one's going to be black, and this one's going to be color dodge, and color 2 on that one is going to be white. The factor for the color burn is going to be 0.475, and the factor on the color dodge is going to be 1. It's actually kind of an interesting way just to create some cool camo, just like that. Let's go ahead and hit Control T, bring up these 2 other guys to texture coordinate and mapping node. We'll just move these over a little bit, make sure object is going into vector. Let's bring in a Voronoi and just put it right here. Make sure distance is going into vector on that noise there. Let's change the settings to F1 Manhattan, and the scale is going to be 10. The randomness is going to be 0, just like that. Let's go ahead and add in a gradient node right before that and change this to radial. Let's come over here and add in a separate XYZ node, place it right here, run object into the vector. We're going to bring in some math nodes. We're going to set the top one as an absolute, and the bottom one's going to be a power one. We're going to set the exponent to actually 4. The X is going into the absolute and the Y is going into the power one. Let's duplicate that absolute and change it to add. We're just going to add these guys together. Let's see what's going on there. I'm going to bring in a color ramp. Let's just put that right here, and black is going to be at 0.05, and white, we're going to keep white at 1. Let's bring in a math node, put it right here, change this to multiply. We're going to change this value to 1.5, just like that. Then what we're going to do is we're going to just create a little node right here by holding down Shift and right click dragging through there. Then I'm going to add in some vector math, which affects all 3 of those variables. So let's put that right here. This first one's going to be scale. The second one is going to be fraction. And the third one is going to be add. We'll set these top 2 at -0.5. It just makes it so all of the shapes are in the middle of those squares there. And this scale we're going to set at 1.6. So we get a bit more of the edges there. Last step, let's come over here and plug the multiply into the scale on that first noise texture we set up. Let's view what's coming out of that color dodge. And there we go. This is texture number 15. There you go, that's it. Hope you were able to follow everything, and if not, please ask me any questions you have. I don't mind chatting about that stuff, and thanks for watching.